Welcome, everyone. Today is the sixth and final session of the Shabbat prayers with Rabbi David Silber. This is the last class in an ongoing series about the tefillot of Shabbat. For today's class, if you have your own preferred siddur, please keep it at hand and at reference, but we will also be sharing sources on screen from Sefaria. And with that, Rabbi Silber, who I believe needs no further introduction.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Kayla. Okay, so in this last class of this series, I wanted to focus on, again, the focus on what is, focus has been what is unique to Shabbat. So, of course, Kabbalat Shabbat is unique to Shabbat. We have no such other service, and it's, relatively late service for the most part. So we spent a fair amount of time on the Friday night service because it's very different. There is something else that's quite interesting in terms of Shabbat, when one thinks about Shabbat in the context of prayer in general. And that's the fact that of course, on Shabbat, there are four prayers. There's the evening prayer, there's the morning prayer, there's the afternoon prayer. That's true every single day. Shacharit, Mincha, and Ma'ariv are the three prayers. And Shabbat, of course, there's the additional prayer, there's the Musaf service as well. So we have our four prayers. That's true of Shabbat. It's true of every day that is a holy day. And it's true of Rosh Chodesh. The special sacrifices were brought, so there's the extra Musaf service. What's different about Shabbat, very interesting, is that the text of the Amidah, Shemona Esrei, as we call it, the silent prayer, which is the core prayer in our tradition. So, for example, on the festivals, it's the same prayer. We say the same thing at night. We say the same thing in the morning. We say the same thing at Mincha. Musaf is always different, but there's no variation. The only exception to that general rule is in terms of Rosh Hashanah. The Rosh Hashanah Musaf has 9 blessings, not 7. All the other prayers on special days have 7 blessings, 3 in the beginning, 3 at the end, 1 to the middle, and they never change. We say on the holidays, and then the text continues with the same, it's exactly the same for each prayer. Shabbat is different. The evening service, the evening text of the Amidah is one thing. Then in the morning, Shacharit is different, and in Mincha it's different. So I thought it would make some sense to discuss and to reflect upon the differences between the 3 Amidot of Shabbat, and if we have a few minutes to discuss Musaf as well. So the text in the Amidah, again, we're talking about the middle section, because the first 3 and the last 3 blessings are always the same. So the middle blessing, which is one blessing, which always concludes the same way, Baruch Atah Hashem B'Kadesh HaShabbat. That's how it ends. God, we bless God who sanctified the Shabbat. So at nighttime, the text that we say, I have the Ashkenazic text, but the Sephardic text is not much different. Very tiny variations. And it begins, the text at the middle of the Amidah starts with Atah Kidashta et Yom HaShvi'i L'Shmecha. Tachlit Maaseh Shamayim Va'aretz Uveirachto Mikol HaYomim Kidashto Mikol HaZmanim V'chein Katuv B'Toratecha. So it starts with a brief statement that you have sanctified the 7th day L'Shmecha. It's interesting, for your name, God's name. God's name is constantly appearing in our prayers. We talk about God's name constantly. So you, God, sanctified the 7th day. In the Torah, when we first encounter what we call Shabbat, the Torah called it the 7th day, as we'll see in a moment. And this 7th day, which was the culmination, tachlit, the word kala, to completion, the completion of the creation of heaven and earth, you blessed it more than all the other days, beirachto mikol hayamim, v'kidashto mikol hazmanim, and you sanctified it more than the other times, referring to the fact that Shabbat is not just the holy day of the week and different from the other days in the week. I'll come back to that shortly, but it's kidashto mikol hazmanim. It's more holy, as it were, than all the other holy days. Zmanim presumably refers to the holy days, the sanctified days, the festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Shabbat is more holy than they. That is reflected in the following halacha, which is that at the culmination of Shabbat every week, there's a tefillah that we say, a bracha, actually. We call it Havdalah. Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol. So we make a blessing at the end of Shabbat. Shabbat is marked by the beginning and the end with a blessing. In the beginning, we call it Kiddush, the sanctification of Shabbat. And at the end of Shabbat, there's reference to the fact that the holy day is departing. And now we encounter Chol, days which have no sanctity. So that's what we call Havdalah. But the truth of the matter is we also say Havdalah, not only when the next day is a regular non-holy day, but we say Havdalah if the next day, if Sunday or Saturday night is a holy day. When a festival falls on Sunday, Shabbat is over, we say Havdalah. The blessing is not Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'chol, but Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'kodesh. God distinguishes between one holy day and the next. And the rule is that you only say Havdalah when you move down in holiness. When you move up in holiness, you don't say Havdalah. So for example, if a festival would fall on a Friday, and then the next day is Shabbat, we make Kiddush on Shabbat, but we don't say Havdalah. Havdalah is always from the higher level sanctity to the lower level sanctity. That's the reference over here in the Amidah, that Shabbat is special, we're blessed from all the days and sanctified even more than the other holy days. And then we quote verses from the Torah. And the verses that we quote from the Torah is the end of the creation, first creation narrative, which describes the creation of the world in 6 days. And then on the 7th day, Vayechu hashamayim v'aretz v'chol tzva'am, Vayechu means it was completed. The heaven and earth and all the appurtenances and all the parts of those things were completed. God completed everything in 6 days, heaven and earth. Vayechal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa. God completed, it doesn't mean God completed it on the 7th day. It was completed on the 6th day. Vayechavi means that having been completed. Having been completed on the 7th day from all the work that God did, Vayishbot bayom hashvi'i, God did not work. God did not work. God desisted from work concerning all the work that God had done. So all the work was done in 6 days. It's completed at the end of the 6 days. So by the 7th day, it's already completed. And it's finished. We notice the word Vayechu hashamayim, Vayechal Elohim, again, Vayechal in the next verse. Vayevarech Elohim et yom hashvi vaykadesh oto, hivo shavat mikol melachto asher bara him la'asot. So these verses, Vayechu, we are reciting at night. Interesting thing is that these verses, taken from the end of the description of creation of heaven and earth, on Friday night, the common practice is to say Vayechu 3 times. The first time we say it is in the Amidah, right here in front of us. And then there's another practice to say Vayechu after we say the Amidah. Right after the Amidah is completed, and before the Chazan engages in this kind of repetition of the Amidah that we discussed. But prior to that, we say Vayechu hashamayim v'aretz v'chol a second time. We say it a second time. And then when we make Kiddush, which begins with course with blessings, but prior to the blessings, as a sort of introduction to Kiddush, the common practice is that to say Vayechu a third time. So obviously Vayechu is seen as the central verses to the evening service of Shabbat. Why we say it 3 times is a very good question. So I noticed that in one of the very early works on the Siddur, 14th century Spanish work on the Siddur, the claim is that we say Vayechu after the Amidah, even though we said it in the Amidah, because when Shabbat falls on a festival, so the Shemona Esrei, we say when Shabbat and the festival coincide, we say the festival Amidah, not the Shabbat text. We say the festival Amidah and mention Shabbat in the text. So we wouldn't say Vayechu in that case, so we say it afterwards. But apparently there is a kind of obligation to say Vayechu. So what is this about? What is the evening service about? So it seems that the evening service is focused on first of all on creation, and the fact that God completed God's creation, Tachlit Baseh Shamayim Va'aretz, and that God actually both blessed the Shabbat, blessed the seventh day, and also sanctified the seventh day by Kadesh Oto. The seventh day is a holy day. The Torah doesn't spell out in the first beginning of the Torah, in chapter 1 of Breshit or whatever, doesn't spell out what Vayevarech and Vayekadesh is. Some of the classical commentaries suggest that the mention of Vayevarech and Vayekadesh, to bless and to sanctify the Shabbat, is a kind of foreshadowing of what comes later, which is a description of what Israel is to do on Shabbat, how Israel is to make the Shabbat holy and special and blessed. Be that as it may, in its initial context, actually, it probably refers to something else. That God sanctified the Shabbat means, in its initial context, that Shabbat is different than the rest of the week. The first 6 days of creation, God is speaking, God is creating. But the seventh day is different. On the seventh day, there is no speech and there's no creation. So Shabbat is different from the other days of the week. And this is interesting, actually. Just want to make a comment that one of the things that Rabbi Soloveitchik emphasized about Shabbat, he made this point often, that one of the ideas of Shabbat is that Shabbat should be different from the other days of the week. Now that's found in all of the halachic works as well. One dresses differently on Shabbat. One prepares for Shabbat. One has special meals for Shabbat. So the idea that the things that we do, we speak differently on Shabbat, we walk differently on Shabbat. I'm not saying we always do that, but the Talmud speaks of that. Your walking on Shabbat should be different than you walk during the week. There you're rushing to work or whatever it is, or rushing to your computer nowadays, but the Shabbat is different. Shabbat is, everything about Shabbat should be different. The idea of the separateness and specialness of Shabbat, something that he emphasized very much. It's found in halakhic text, and it probably is the plain meaning of what the Torah says. So in effect, what we're saying is, what we're recalling at night is the idea that Shabbat is a day that God has fashioned, and we are witnessing that, or maybe even testifying to that fact, and we are thinking of Shabbat in those terms. The so-called Kabbalat Shabbat means Shabbat is there. We didn't create it. It is created. It's every 7 days. We have no part in creating Shabbat. It comes automatically every 7 days. It's not like the festivals that depend on what day we declare the month to begin. So the nighttime, the focus on the night is to reflect upon the fact that Shabbat is actually a reflection of the fact that God created heaven and earth. God is the creator, and this is a day that God has fashioned, and our role is to accept it. And that's what we call this Kabbalat Shabbat. So that's the evening service. And again, we cite verses from the Torah, but the verses we cite of Vayichu Hashemayim v'Aretz, etc. That's the night. That's the evening service. Let me just say something about the morning service, and I'll stop and take comments and questions. The morning service is completely different, actually. The Amidah in the morning service, very striking Amidah. So the middle blessing begins with the words, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko. Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko. It's a very unusual blessing, actually. Moshe should rejoice in the gift he was given. This refers to the Torah. So Moshe rejoices in the Torah. Eved Ne'eman Karatu. You called Moses a faithful servant. Chlil Tiferet B'Rosho Natatu. You placed a crown upon his head, crown of majesty upon his head. B'Yamdo Lifanecha Al Har Sinai. When he stood before you at Mount Sinai. U'Shnei Luchot Avanim Horid B'Yado. And he brought down 2 tablets of stone. V'chatuv Bahem Shmirat Shabbat. And on the tablets was inscribed the mitzvah of Shabbat. It's in the 10 Commandments. It's the 4th of the 10 Commandments. And then we cite V'chein Katuv B'Toratecha, and it's so it says in your Torah. And then we cite verses from chapter 31 of the book of Shemot. The verses that we cite, V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, those verses, by the way, are not from the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments are chapter 20. These are verses from chapter 31. So actually, this is sort of enigmatic, and I want to say a few things about Yismach Moshe. It's a very enigmatic tefillah, and this is the focus on Shabbat, in the Shabbat morning tefillah. By the way, Yismach Moshe, and I was checking in ancient older Sidurim and everything. So when it comes to the evening text, and when it comes to Mincha, there are some variations. Different communities had different variations of the text. But Yismach Moshe, everybody said. The morning tefillah of Yismach Moshe is universal. Everybody said Yismach Moshe. So I wanted to reflect for a while on Yismach Moshe. Let me first make the point that others have made, not original to me, but it's an interesting fact, and that is that Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, the claim is that Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko is part of a larger poem. And the reason they say that, and perhaps it's even, I don't remember now if the larger poem is found elsewhere, but the fact of the matter is that we know that the poets, the ancient poets of Israel, added many tefillot inside the Amidah. They're called piyutim, and often they're in alphabetical order. So the first three blessings would be Aleph Bet Gimel would be the first blessing, and Daled Hey Vav would be the second, and Zayin Chet Tet would be the third. The first three blessings of the Amidah. If that were the case, and probably we do have such poems, then the next three would be Yud, Kaf, and Lamed. And Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko, we have your Yud. Kievet Neman Karatalo, that's the first line. And the next line is Kilil Tiferet B'Roshon Atata B'Yamdo Lefanecha Al Har Sinai. You placed upon him a diadem, a crown of majesty. That's Kaf. And we have Shnei Luchot Avonim Hori B'Yado, but the different text has Luchot Avonim Hori B'Yado, which is a Lamed. And therefore it means that this was probably a lot of larger poetic additions to the Amidah. And Yismach Moshe, Yud and Kaf and Lamed. It still doesn't explain why the focus on Moshe. What is this focus on Shabbat morning, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko? It's very strange. So different people have different theories about this. The one that I thought was plain simplest, actually, and this is attested by others as well. Some say this as well, and that is that the Gemara claims that the Torah was given on Shabbat. Let's start with that. The Torah was given on Shabbat. Now, that's and therefore one could say we mentioned the Torah on Shabbat because the Torah was given on Shabbat, and we know that, for example, the day of Shabbat, when it comes to the Torah, has a very special status. Not only do we call up 7 people to the Torah on Shabbat with 7 aliyot, which is more than any other day. The number of aliyot are a function of the sanctity of the day. So the festivals have 5. Rosh Chodesh has 4. You have every other day, a fast day has 4. Every other day has 3 aliyot. And Yom Kippur has 6. It's holier. Shabbat is 7. It's the holiest day. Shabbat is 7. But not only that, it has more aliyot, but actually the Torah is read on Shabbat. That is to say, we complete the Torah. The idea of a seder, of reading the Torah is completed through the readings of the Shabbat. The only exception to the rule would be Simchas Torah. But outside of that, every other Torah reading in which we are going to complete the Torah is read on Shabbat. So Shabbat is a very special standing when it comes to the Torah. However, having said all that, and that's obviously true, but I think that over here, Yismach Moshe, actually, there's something else, which is central to Shabbat and central to the prayer of Yismach Moshe. And that is that the question is, what event is this Mach Moshe referring to? Moshe was very happy, not chelko, when you gave him this gift, when his portion was given to Moshe. You called him a faithful servant. Even neman karatalo. What is this referring to? What does it mean? Klil tiferet b'rosho natata. You placed a crown upon his head. So it's commonly understood to refer to a medrash that when the Israel stood at Har Sinai, everybody got a crown. Could be, but I actually believe it means something else over here, which makes to me a lot more sense in terms of the prayer. That the reference here is not to Moshe going up on Shabbat to receive the Torah. I don't think that's the reference. The reference is something else. The reference is not the first time Moshe went to receive the Torah, but the reference is the second time Moshe came to get the Torah. After the tablets had been smashed, and after the episode of the golden calf, and Moshe prays for the people, and the people are mourning, and God says to Moshe, come up a second time, hew for yourself tablets, and come up a second time. And Moshe goes up quietly the second time. And when Moshe comes down after 40 days with the second tablets, the Torah says that when Moshe came down the mountain the second time, his face was radiating. There were beams of light coming out of his head. Moshe lo yada ki karan or panav b'dabro. His face was radiant. His face was shining, to the extent that when he comes down, people are afraid to go near him. And he puts on a mask to shield himself from the people. That, I think, is the reference over here. And the deep point of this is the following. When Moshe came down the mountain the second time with these tablets, the Torah says that when he came down, he taught them the Torah that he had been taught. The Torah describes what he did. This is found at the end of the 24th chapter of the book of Shemot. And I'll simply read to you what it says in chapter 24, after Moshe comes down the mountain. This is chapter 24, starts with verse number 12. And Moshe says, God said to Moshe, go up to the mountain, and I will give you the tablets and the Torah and the mitzvah, etc. Moses goes up with Yoshua, and I'm sorry, it's not 24. It's chapter 2, that's the first time. Chapter 34. Chapter 34, my era, chapter 34. It says the following. Moshe came down, verse 29, chapter 34, verse 29. When by Hebrew read it, Moshe mehar Sinai, u'shnei luchot ha'edut biyad Moshe b'rito menahar, u'Moshe lo yada ki karan or panav b'dabro ito. Moshe didn't know his face was radiant, but everybody sees it and they're afraid. So vayikra lehem Moshe, Moshe called to them and they returned. Vayashuv le'elav Aaron b'chol, and Aaron and the princes, the heads of the tribes came, and Moshe spoke to them. And afterwards, all of Israel. And Moshe commanded them what God had taught him at Har Sinai. And when Moshe completed, he put on his mask. That's the end of chapter 34. So Moshe teaches the Torah. Then you get to chapter 35. Verse number 1. Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael vayom. Moshe gathers all of Israel. And he said to them, Eila hadvarim asher tzivah Hashem la'asot ocham. This is what God commanded to do. And what's the first thing Moshe says? Sheshet yomim te'yoseh melacha. You may work for 6 days. Uvayom hashviyi yiyeh lachem kodesh. Shabbat Shabbaton l'Hashem. The seventh day is a day of Shabbat Shabbaton, a day of rest. No one's permitted to work. Oseh b'lo melacha yumat, a capital offense. Do not burn any fires or tvaru eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom haShabbat. So in the Chumash, what's interesting is Moshe goes up the mountain a second time. The first time there was the golden calf. Now he comes down the second time and he begins to instruct the people what God had taught him, the Torah, the mitzvah. But the one mitzvah the Torah singles out, actually, one mitzvah is the mitzvah of Shabbat. So the mitzvah, why does Moshe start with Shabbat? That's Shabbat, in a sense, is emblematic of all the mitzvot. And Moshe starts with Shabbat because presumably Shabbat not only represents all of the mitzvot, but Shabbat is Moshe's way of telling the people that the covenant with God, because the tablets are called the tablets of the covenant, and those tablets have been broken. But Moshe wants to tell the people is the covenant has been restored. The covenant is still binding. So how does Moshe tell the people the covenant is binding? Moshe says, here's the first mitzvah you have to know, the mitzvah of Shabbat, because Shabbat is a covenantal mitzvah. Because when the Torah speaks of Shabbat, it talks about it in terms of covenant. And in fact, the verses in which the Torah makes it clear that the Shabbat is a covenantal mitzvah is exactly the text of chapter 31 of Shemot that we say in the morning Amidah of Shabbat. V'chein katuv, as it says in your Torah, v'shamru v'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat, v'asot et HaShabbat v'dorotam brit olam. That Shabbat is an eternal covenant. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti v'yolam. This is a sign that 6 days God created heaven and earth, and the seventh day God rested, as it were. So the point is, and then it continues, and this covenant was made with Israel specifically, not with other nations, specifically with Israel. So Shabbat is covenantal. That is what is the central theme of the morning prayer. And the reference over here is to the fact that not just the Torah was given on Shabbat, because that's the first time, but the second time Moshe comes up to get the Torah and comes down and tells us about Shabbat is Moshe's way of saying that what the Shabbat represents is the covenant between God and the people. And even after the golden calf, because one might have thought that after the golden calf, the covenant has been broken. That's not the case. And the evidence, the proof that it's not the case is when Moshe says when he comes down the mountain, he gathers everybody together, all of Israel together, and he says, listen, Shabbat still obtains, and that obtains means if you violate it, it comes with punishment because the covenant is always two-sided. There's responsibilities on both sides, promise and responsibility.
That was unmuted. Oh,
Excuse me? Okay, I'll take comments or questions. If anybody has comments or questions about this, anything that we've discussed so far, happy to hear it.
Rabbi Silber, I would like to know how to get your book in English on Esther.
It doesn't exist. You can't get it. It hasn't been translated yet.
Oh, I see.
Right. Any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
Rabbi Silber, I want to ask you a question.
Please.
When it says that Hashem stopped doing malacha, it just struck me. It's such an odd phrase to use because God can do anything.
Right.
Malacha seems such a human term to use. The word malacha, when I think of it, comes up that you can't do it on Yom Tov for us. And it comes up with the malacha with the Mishkan. Is it used in any other context besides Shabbat or Yom Tov, with all the laws, lo tasu malacha, and with the other than the Mishkan?
Yes, it's used elsewhere, but the Mishkan and the Shabbat link are very significant. One could even make the argument, I think, that the Mishkan it's used, and it's used elsewhere. It's used actually in last week's Torah reading. The word malacha comes up. No? Let's see. There malacha refers to, I think, the various animals that, let's see where it's just for a moment to take a look at that.
Yaakov said the animals go
I'm
slowly.
pretty sure the word malacha comes up there as well. It typically means work, right?
When the
For example,
slowly.
He calls his property malacha. Sometimes malacha means the work that you do, and sometimes malacha means what you achieve through the work. So that's malacha over there. And malacha probably is related to, it's interesting, and Kasuta makes this point. He makes the point that even though the Torah takes great pains to disassociate God from any, in the first chapter of the Torah, to disassociate God from any kind of human. God is not represented in first creation narrative as human. God is transcendent. God merely speaks and things happen. But yes, in Vayechu, we have the word malach appears several times. I believe it's 3 times. perhaps is there to, I don't remember what Kasuto says, but perhaps it's there that the Torah there already in the seventh day is setting up sort of a paradigm for future malacha. Because where it comes up later, of course, is in terms of the building of the Mishkan.
Mishkan,
Here you have
right.
the word malacha. It's related to the word malach, I presume, which is agency. So later on, we are in building the Mishkan, we are acting as agents to build the Mishkan. But yeah, it's a good question because it seems to be somehow somewhat inappropriate for the sense that the Torah wants to convey in chapter 1, which is that God is transcendent and creates everything with no effort, with speech alone, etc., no opposition and no difficulty. So it's true that the word mulacha, at least as we understand it, and later on refers to actual work, does have a sense of of actually effort, human effort in particular. So it's a very good point. Yeah, so maybe that's the reason. Maybe the Torah there is already setting up. Say Vayikadesh, Vayivarech, it sets up later on how we are to observe the Shabbat. But the point over here about this idea that Shabbat and Torah have a very special relationship, and that the focus in the morning service is the fact that Shabbat is the day of receiving the Torah, and more than that, that Shabbat was the mitzvah through which Moshe made clear that the first reception of the Torah still holds. That is to say, we get the Torah, get a second chance, get the second time, but the idea that we have received the Torah and we have agreed to, right? We have willingly, voluntarily accepted the Torah. The evidence of that is the Shabbat. The first thing that Moshe says, what happened earlier before the golden calf, and there was a covenant, the Brit, that Brit still holds. And it's special in that sense. So Shabbat is the day of receiving the Torah, but more than that, it represents the fact that the Torah can be given, that the Torah still lives on through the Shabbat. So that's the
Excuse
second.
me, because
Yes.
I was just thinking, because we call the work in the Mishkan the avoda. We don't use the word malacha. Like there's such a difference. The
Right.
word
Well, actually, the
malacha.
truth is, when you're looking at the Mishkan, you have to look at it carefully because the Torah sometimes uses malacha. Sometimes it uses the term melechet avoda, actually. Melechet avoda is another term the Torah uses. And yes, avoda is, for the word eved, avoda means service.
And that's what you're supposed to do, but while melechet avoda is what you're not supposed to do, it seems to me.
Right. But the Mishkan, but the Torah does use the word malacha in terms of the Mishkan. In fact, not only does it use the term malacha in terms of the Mishkan, but if you look at the Chumash at the end of the book of Shemot, you'll see that the very language of building the Mishkan is actually, one might say, lifted from or taken from, or exactly parallel
from
the
Bria
language
Sa'olam.
of God's creation.
Right.
So in a sense, one could say that this is how Buber understood it. Buber understood it that in the first creation narrative, it's God doing everything. We do nothing. We are created beings, and we're not partnering. So in the first creation narrative, we're not partnering with God. We're created on the sixth day with the animals, and creation precedes us, etc. When it comes to the Mishkan, Buber argued, that's a different kind of creation. That's a creation in which it's God's temple. God gives the instructions, but we also carry it out. We, being the Jewish people, carry it out. The men, the women, everybody, the volunteers, etc. And that creation of sacred space is one that's done in partnership with God. In contrast to the first creation, Buber made the claim that that is the ideal. The ideal was a partnership in which the human and God, I'm not saying we're equal partners necessarily, but we are co-creators. And I would add to that point that it's very striking that the main architect of the Mishkan is Betzalel.
Right.
And the Torah says about Betzalel, "V'amaleo tov ruach Elohim." He's filled with the Spirit of God. Well, that's how the first creation narrative starts. That's the beginning of the Chumash. Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. So in the first creation narrative, it's God's Ruach Elohim, the Ruach of God that hovers above the waters, and that somehow is instrumental in the creation. Maybe Ruach Elohim refers to God's wisdom, etc. but it's certainly all about God. There are no partners in chapter 1 of Genesis. And when you get later on to Ruach Elohim, that's a human being who's filled with Ruach Elohim, and that suggests some kinds of partnership. So my point is that the point is well taken about the word malacha. It is in a way jarring when you look at the overall sense of chapter 1. On the other hand, maybe what the Torah is already doing is setting up the second story. That's what I think it is. It's setting up the parallel story of the Mishnah.
Nechama
Anybody else with
Leibowitz
a comment?
writes about
Yes?
Nechama Leibowitz writes about that, the parallel between the two.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. It's found in the Million Midrashim. It's found all over the place. I'm not familiar with, I may have seen it once, but when you read the Chumash, it's hard to miss it because the language is drawn both from the first creation narrative and also the second. It's drawn from both of them, all kinds of interesting parallels. And the question is what to make of them. There are all kinds of parallels, which doesn't necessarily mean they're identical. It also could be by contrast. There are kruvim in the first story. There are kruvim in the second story. The kruvim in the first story block your entrance back into the garden. The kruvim in the second story are hovering above the ark from which God speaks, right? So they're in a way opposites. So yet one has to, Shabbat is central to the Mishkan is twice mentioned in conjunction with Shabbat. Chapter 31 is God's last command prior to the golden calf and after the instructions of the Mishkan. That's chapter 31. That's Vishamru. Chapter 35 that I've recalled is just prior to building the Mishkan. So the Shabbat is intimately bound up with the Mishkan. It's a point that I've tried to emphasize over the first many sessions, that Shabbat is parallel to the Mishkan because the Mishkan is about sacred space and Shabbat's about sacred time. Okay, so these are the first two Amidot, the themes of the first two Amidot. And then we come to the third Amidah. We'll skip Musaf. Musaf is different, obviously. But let's get to the third Amidah of Shabbat, one of the most beautiful prayers we have, I think. And that is quite striking tefillah in Mincha. Mincha feels completely different, of course. Not only does it feel different, interesting thing about Mincha is, and this is something to reflect upon in general, that the nusach for Mincha is different than the nusach for the rest of Shabbos. Each holy day has its own nusach, right? Of course, we know that, right? Yismach Moshe b'manat chalko, Yeved ne'eman karoto lo. That's the nusach for Shabbos, right? Kiril tiferet b'roshon natato lo, etc. But that's true of all that's true of the Shabbos davening in general, right? But when it gets to Mincha time, the Ashkenazim have a different nusach. Ato echad b'shimcha echad. It's a different nusach. Umiki amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz tiferet gedulah v'ateret Yeshua. Different. It's a different nusach, a different feel to it, completely different. Very beautiful prayer. So what is this prayer of Ato echad b'shimcha echad? Umiki amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. This is actually very interesting. What is the theme of Shabbos Mincha? So first of all, you are one. I would say, what do you mean you are one and your name is one? What do you mean your name is one? What do you mean your name? What's Shimcha Echad? Probably Echad is better translated, not so much one. I would say unique, singular. You are singular. And your manifestation in the world, that's God's name. The way God manifests in the world is God's name. The way we appear to others, that's the name. Right? There's me and there's how I appear to others. You are unique, you are singular. And the way you appear in this world, the way you are present in the world is singular. That's as far as God. And who is like your people Israel, a singular nation in the world? And here, first of all, that Umiki Amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz is actually a phrase from the Bible. It's taken from the Bible. Where do we have Umiki Amcha Yisrael? Who said this? Umiki Amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz?
David HaMelech.
Yes, David HaMelech said it. And where did David HaMelech say this? You remember where he said it?
Yeah, after Hashem told him that he cannot build a Beit HaMikdash.
Exactly right. when God says to King David, you are not to build the temple. David wants to build the temple in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, Shmuel Bet. And God says, thank you, no thank you. Your son will build it. I didn't ask you to build it. You're not going to build it. And David's response is an amazing response. And that is, okay, he calls himself God's servant. And he basically, in that chapter, very importantly for the book of Shmuel, says, he acknowledges that I am your servant, and I am also Israel's servant. As the king is to serve two masters, actually. Primarily one master, which is God, but then there's also the people. And the king is chosen king to serve the people. And in that context, David says, now, the overall context is about the Mikdash. So the authors of this prayer cite a verse from the building of the temple. Someday someone else will build the temple. David, thank you very much. Good idea. Not now. And David says, okay. David thanks God for the promise that his descendant will build the temple. And that's there's a kind of identity between, or parallel between, God on one hand, who's singular, and Israel is singular on the other hand. And now the prayer continues. Tiferet Gedula V'Ateret Yeshua. Yom Menucha U'Kedusha Li'amcha Natata. The question is what that first half of this line means. Tiferet Gedula V'Ateret Yeshua. Something majestic which reflects greatness, and a crown of salvation. Then it says Yom Menucha, a day of rest, and a day of sanctity you have given your people. The question is, what does Tiferet Gedula V'Ateret Yeshua refer to? That this is a crown of salvation and something that represents greatness or majesty. I thought it refers, I saw different opinions about this, but in my humble opinion, Tiferet Gedula V'Ateret Yeshua refers to Shabbos. That Shabbos is a sign of greatness. It's a majestic, something majestic. And it's a crown of salvation. Crown of salvation, the idea being that God took us out of Egypt, and that the sign that we are free people is the Shabbat. After all, we say over and over again on Shabbat, we call Shabbat Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, don't we? In Kiddush, we call this in Kiddush, we say the Shabbat is a remembrance of the fact that we left Egypt, because slaves can't have Shabbat. A slave doesn't have time. A slave operates on someone else's time. So the idea that we left Egypt to serve God, and one of the ways that we serve God is by observing God's Shabbat, by honoring God's Shabbat. So Shabbat is both Tiferet Gedula V'Ateret Yeshua. And I was thinking, I wonder about, we didn't begin, but early on we discussed the little poem L'cha Dodi. And L'cha Dodi actually is interesting that Al-Kabitz, in his poem L'cha Dodi, makes reference both to Tiferet and also to Ateret. That's how he ends. But we v'shalom Ateret Bala. He calls Shabbat Ateret Bala, the crown of right? The husband's crown. The Shabbat is the husband's crown. It's Israel's crown, the Shabbat. And Tiferet, right? Livshi b'gdei Tifartei Ami. Put on the clothing of your majesty. Ami, which probably means, which is my people. My people is Tiferet. So the idea that I wonder if Al-Kabitz was lifting it either from the afternoon prayer or from the same place the afternoon prayer takes it. So, but this is the point of the third tefillah, that Shabbat represents. Yes, we spoke about a covenant in the second prayer. That's more of a kind of agreement or a contract. But over here, it's much deeper than that. It's something about the Shabbat is a way of actually a gift that actually ennobles Israel. And there's something about the singularity of those who observe the Shabbat, which is a crown, which is majestic. Yom Menucha U'Kedusha Li'amcha Natata. So the day of Shabbat is a day of a holy day, And how we have the theme of the third blessing, the third Amidah. The key word in the third Amidah is the word menucha. It appears over and over and over again. A day of menucha. We usually translate a day of rest. When you read it actually, it sounds like it's more than just not working. You can go to sleep and you're resting. But it sounds different over here. First of all, in the third line, also very striking, Avraham Yagel Yitzchak Yiranein, Yaakov Uvanav Yanuchuvo. So there's a reference in this little poem to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Avram is rejoicing, Yagel, Yitzchak also is crying out, presumably in joy. Yaakov and Yaakov's children, that's us, are resting on the Shabbat. And the kind of rest is now described. It's not just not working. Menuchat ava unedava emet b'emunah shalom b'shalva hashket b'vetach menucha shlema shatarot seba yakiru v'necha v'yedu ki meitcha hi menuchatam v'yam menuchatam yakdishu et shemecha. In other words, your children, that's Israel, God's children, shall know that true menucha comes from God. I would call it not just not working, or serenity, peace of mind, serenity. And through their resting, they sanctify your name. So the idea of Shabbat as a Yom Menucha is interesting. And I did want to say a couple of words about Menucha, I think as it's reflected in the third prayer of Shabbat. I think it's one of the most beautiful prayers that we have in our tradition. And I noticed something very interesting I wanted to mention to you, extremely interesting, about the text of this third Amidah of Shabbat. This is the text that we have that's come down to us, no question. But I was looking at some early Sidurim, and I noticed that in two of them, it probably appears in more, in addition to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it mentions somebody else. It mentions Moshe. And Moshe is also mentioned in the morning prayer, Yismach Moshe. Moshe, generally speaking, is not mentioned so much in our prayers. If you think about it, in the daily prayer that we say so many times, there's Abraham, there's Isaac, there's Jacob, and there's David. David is mentioned later. That's it. Moshe is not mentioned at all. Yes, in Birkat Kohanim, when they say there's Kakatuv of Moshe, but basically he's not in the prayers. But on Shabbat, we have Moshe in the second prayer, Yismach Moshe. And here, I found in at least two different places the following. It says, Avram Yagel Yitzchak Yiranein, Yaakov Uvanav Yanuchavo. And then the next line is, Ula Moshe Avdecha. And to Moshe, your servant, you said, Tzivito Lemar, or you said, Amarto, Tzivito Lemar, Panaye Lechu V'hanichoti Lach. I will accompany you, and I will guide you. Now, that's added in the old Sidurim, that's added after Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now, when did God say to Moshe, was said to Moshe after the golden calf. When God said to Moshe, tell the people they can go into the land, I'm not going to go with you. And Moshe prays for the people. Moshe says to God, you have to go with the people. You have to go with me. Oh, with you, I'm willing to go. I'm not, because I'm okay with you, right? For sure. The Torah in that section plays over and over with the word, with the letters chet and nun. Chen, hanichoti, right? Many plays of chanun, chanoti, over and over again. And panaye lechu v'hanichoti lach means I will accompany you and I will guide you. That's when God is saying to Moshe, okay, I agree. The context is I'm gonna go with you and I'm gonna go with them. I'm gonna go with them into the land. Now the Torah refers to the land of Canaan in other places. Ki lovatem ad ata el hamenucha v'el hanachara. The land, the end point in the Torah is called the place of menucha and the place of nachara. And I think what the Shabbat service is doing over here, first of all, right? is, of course, God's way of saying, I will go with the people. And as I mentioned earlier, the evidence that God is with the people after the golden calf is the fact that Moshe comes down the mountain the second time and commands the people about Shabbat. Shabbat is the sign, in fact, that what God has said, I will accompany you, I will guide you. I'm not going to send somebody else or some angel. I'm going to go with you, is actually true. But I think more than that, when we think about the Shabbat, the text of the Shabbat prayers, especially in Mincha, but even in the other prayers, you have over and over again here the word menucha that appears many, many times. And then in the blessing, the culminating blessing of all the Shabbat prayers, Elokeinu v'Elokeinu Avotenu, Ritzena b'Menuchatenu, accept our menucha, right? And then later on, Hanchilenu Hashem Elokeinu, and grant us as a portion, Hanchilenu, Nachala, right? Ramenucha v'Yohanachala. Ramenucha v'Yohanachala refers in the Torah to the goal of getting back to the land. The land is called Menucha and it's called Nachala. What the Shabbos service does actually is it takes this idea of sacred space, whether it's the land, the Menucha and Nachala, or whether it's the Mikdash. And essentially what the claim that the prayer is making is that in addition to the sacred space, the prayer is not negating sacred space, but the prayer is saying in addition to sacred space, is also sacred time. And that sacred time and sacred space are somehow related to each other, or they are two different ways to reach God, either through sacred time or sacred space. That's what I think our prayer services are doing. And if, in point of fact, the first creation narrative of the Torah ends with Shabbat, with Vayichulu, right? The second creation narrative is the Garden of Eden, which is about sacred space. And the Shabbos prayers actually are picking up on that, because Shabbat obviously is about sacred time. But it frames it in terms of the language of sacred space. So actually, I thought that was extremely interesting, that line in the Amida that we don't have, U'lemoshe avdecha tzivita, u'lemor, panay elechu v'hanichoti lach, v'hanichoti, which plays off menucha, nechei, etc. Right? And Moshe said to God, after God reveals God to Moshe, Moshe has to, take us as your portion, right? He didn't mean just bring us to a land. He means we are God's portion. We are God's nachala. So the Shabbat service in general is all about, especially as you move through the Shabbat, starts with Shabbat as God's day. But it moves then from there to seeing Shabbat as a day of partnership and seeing the Shabbat actually as a kind of gift. It's a gift because it's a way to sanctify, that we can live as a sanctified life. We are sanctifying God because we attest to God's creation, but through the observance of the Shabbat, we are also choosing to live a holy path. So it reminds me of the, right? Kadoshim Tiyu. The Torah says we should be a holy people. Ki kadosh ani Hashem, says God, because I am holy. That's a theme that we have in the Chumash. And the best example of holiness is in fact the holiest day. As we say Friday night, it's holier than any other day. Not just different from the days of the week. It's the holiest day of the year. We don't think of it that way because it comes every 7 days. But it is in fact, has the highest level of Kedusha, which manifests in a whole variety of ways. So this is the third tefillah. Atah echad v'shimcha echad is a kind of parallel that we're drawing. And through the Shabbat, the uniqueness of Israel is reflected in the fact that we have accepted and observed the Shabbat. That's our prayer. So those are the three tefillot of Shabbat. They're actually very special. And there's nothing like them because all the other days, it's the same prayer over and over again. In the Shabbat, there are different dimensions to Shabbat. I'll just conclude with the following observation that others have made about Shabbat, the three prayers of Shabbat. Some have said the following, that the three prayers of Shabbat reflect three different times. The Friday night service is talking about creation. That's in the past. The second prayer is about receiving the Torah. That was also an event in the past, but the Torah is with us always. So in a certain sense, that's past and also present. In the third prayer, they claim, Atah echad v'shimcha echad. That's a reference to the Messianic times. Right? In the future, Yeh Hashem echad v'shmo echad. We're not there yet. So the Shabbat service, they claim, is reflective of past, present, and future. There's what happened in the past, there's the past that's with us today, and then there's the anticipated, the hoped for future of Atah echad v'shimcha echad. I'll stop at this point. Are there any comments or questions? There's a lot more here, but this is, I thought, the goal here is just to connect us more deeply to what many of us are saying all the time, but just to think more about the Shabbat service and unique elements of the Shabbat service. So we focus on two. What is Friday night service? That's obviously unique to Shabbat. And then there's the Amidot. There are other things as well, but these, I think, these really jump out at you. Yes.
Rabbi,
Yes.
when it said, can you explain, please, again, maybe the Vahanchilenu that we say every time, is that referring to the Nachala of Eretz Canaan and connecting that with Shabbat? And could you also explain why sometimes it's bo, ba, bum?
Okay, the bo, ba, bum, I believe, is like some Kabbalistic business. It's related to what I mentioned earlier, that at night, they see the night as simply as more of in the Kabbalists divide the world